Good evening, everybody. This is Marty from Dawgs blog with today's podcast on October 23rd, 2018, in regards to the Frank Carson et al. Trial. Um, Tom's report is up from this morning. My noontime report was up. Apparently, quite a few people have seen that already. And this afternoon, we had a DNA expert on the stand talking about the evidence that was recovered from Mariposa County. So the jury was up around 1:36 p.m. The judge was on the bench at about 1:41, I believe it was. So it's not too bad. On the stand was a Gary Harmer, DNA expert out of the SERI lab, that's SERI lab in Richmond, California. He's a biologist, a forensic biologist, and he's a chief forensic examiner, and he's also the executive director. They went through his education: CSU, Sacramento in '76, UC Berkeley. He trained with a guy from Scotland Yard at Berkeley. And a lot of other stuff. There was a long history of education and work and stuff here. I'm not going to go through it all. But he was involved in the initiation of DNA testing and establishing DNA testing. The way he sounded, I tend to believe it. The way he sounded. And some of the things he was doing in the late 70s and into the 80s. And I know into the 80s and late 80s is when DNA started becoming formidable in criminal cases. They talked about the type. There's PCR testing, and I don't know what the abbreviations mean. But it's something that he initially was involved in back in the early 90s. Then they moved up to other type of testing, and now they use what they call a global marker type of testing. It's more defined. It has more markers in the DNA gene, whatever it's called. I'm not going to say all this right because I'm by no means an expert here. And he has multiple certifications and awards. So, but he did say recently that the FBI. Not recently, it was a few years ago, the FBI came out with a new standard of DNA marking, and they use marking, for lack of a better term, marking numbers. It used to be you'd have to have 15 markers to establish DNA, or the possibility of somebody being on that included or excluded list. They don't actually ever say, yes, that was this person, or no, that wasn't person. They exclude and exclude people. He's testified 500 times as a forensic pathologist in court all over the country, a lot in California. He's testified 290 times and qualified as an expert in California. He's also testified in military and federal court. He's published many papers and publications and did a lot of research papers and a lot of stuff that's sent out through the community. He does about 70% prosecutor work and about 30% defense attorney work. He also did some presentations on false confessions in 2014, and this was a case that he had that he talked about back east a few years back. He does all the DNA training in-house. He does numerous workshops, and he trains people to testify apparently in court in regards to this stuff, catching the important stuff. So they finally got down to it. That was in a nutshell. Believe me, it took a lot longer than that to get all through that. He was offered to the court as an expert. The judge did certify him. There was no objections. Item number one that he had looked at was a Carhartt jacket. He said it was in poor condition, partially deteriorated. It was discolored in front and back of the jacket. There was also some discoloration on the interior. His first presumptuous test is a hemoglobin test where it reacts to the material that you have that you're testing reacts to hydrogen peroxide. He said basically it's that simple. And it depends on the color that it turns if it's a presumptuous test for blood or hemoglobin. He did a presumption off the liner of the jacket. He also did the jacket itself. We're talking about the inner liner and the jacket, the outer liner. He actually took pieces off the jacket. He snipped little pieces off, cut them out, and put them into sterile water to check them for blood. Going through the testing process that they go through. And he said there was positive results for blood. He was also able to confirm that it was human blood. The strength of those positive areas gave us what he called a slow positive. So that is not a real confirmed test at that point, but there's more that he's going to do. That presumptive test that I just talking about is also can show up from an animal. So it's not a confirmed test for a human. It's confirmed blood, which could be an animal. Confirmation test for human blood. There's a sample on the card, the little card, what he called a card. It was negative for human blood. So he's saying there was no blood on the jacket. Also, some of the factors that affect the blood, he said the microbes in soil, if it's laying on the soil, the microbes can affect that sample and make it deteriorate because of bacteria growth and moisture and things like that. Just being exposed to the environment, soil, those type of things can make it deteriorate as a sample and can affect the results. And the longer the exposure causes a detriment to the blood. A degradation of the has an effect on the results, is what he's saying. Again, the clothing exposed to the soil will lessen the ability to detect. The clothing exposed to the elements for a year and a half will have an effect. And again, the moisture, the heat, the cold, the dirt, whatever else in the other area will be detrimental to getting results. He then tested item number 2, which was the work boots. Again, they were in poor condition, heavily soiled. They were not completely intact. He couldn't remember if the laces were missing or not off the boot. He was talking about the discoloration on the boot. He tested for blood. It was negative. Again, he said the soil could affect, the climate, etc., again, could affect that. Marlissa Ferrer kept going back to that in her questioning. The next item he tested was some swabs that were already taken. There was 2 swabs that were already taken by somebody else on the carabiner with the key ring and the keys. So they sent him the swabs, and there was a discoloration on one of the swabs. Again, the discoloration can vary for various reasons. It could be a rust color due to deterioration of the metal and so on that was on that swab. Again, there was no. He also tested for DNA on that swab. It did not test positive for hemoglobin or blood, but he also tested it for DNA. She did not do the results at this time. She just went down what he tested. We'll get into the results more specifically. There was a shirt in a paper bag that was wrapped in another. For some reason, the evidence. The shirt was in an evidence bag, a paper evidence bag, but it was also wrapped in some paper, like it might have been butcher's paper. I don't know. He didn't clarify. The lower half of the shirt had been tore off. He did a visual exam of the discoloration, and he did a presumptive test on that upper half of the shirt, mostly he said in the upper region, and it tested negative on a presumption test. Except there was an upper outside panel that gave positive for blood. One small area he was talking to in the upper shirt, maybe up on the shoulder or something, I don't know. He didn't really say, he just said in the upper panel of the shirt. And those results came out negative for blood, for human blood. The shirt exposed to the elements again, they went into the elements that may have caused that to happen. Item number 5 was the mushroomed spent bullet. Remember, there was 2 bullets found with the evidence. One bullet, they don't know where it came from. It was an intact, unspent bullet. It was in its casing, hadn't been fired. There's another one that's a mushroomed bullet that was found either under the jacket or under the pants. She testified Cherie Hendricks testified to 2 different things in Mariposa. She wrote one thing in a report, but saying another thing on the stand. But this bullet was a spent bullet. It was mushroomed, corroded. And he said on the base of the bullet, there was some material from an unknown source that was on that bullet, and it was a .22 caliber bullet, by the way. He took the bullet, and he put the bullet in a container, the solution, whatever, how they do it, and he extracted DNA out of that material. And again, he mentioned now they're required to use that global filer. That's the FBI standard to use to get the 20 points for a DNA makeup or the markings to try to establish who and what. Items 6 and 7 was some swab markings that were previously in the DOJ lab prior. Apparently they sent him all the stuff that they had. There were stains on the tip. They were sent in a Ziploc, sealed in an evidence bag, but the swabs themselves were in a Ziploc from the Department of Justice, and there was 6 of them that were sent to him. I don't know what all 6 were. He didn't really clarify, but he was able to extract 4 out of the 6. Some of them, 2 of them, I think, were reference samples or something that the DOJ used. So he said they were no use to him. It was something like that. Item number 8. Some femur bone dust that had been sent over him off of Corey Kaufman's femur bone. They took part of his bone, they ground it up into real fine powder, and he was using that as a to identify Corey Kaufman's DNA in his testing. And there'd already been some done on that apparently already too. So buccal samples received. There was 10 samples. Actually, there was 9. He said 10, but there was 9. The buccal samples are, remember, just the cheek swabs. Robert Woody, Daljeet Atwell, Georgia DiFilippo, Christine DiFilippo, Scott McFarland, Baljeet Atwell, Edward Quintanar, Walter Wells, and Frank CARSON. These were all samples that they had gotten a court order to get those samples from everybody involved. He did extract DNA from all of those samples. The carabiner swab had a weak mixture of at least 3 people. There's what they call a major contributor who had the strongest sample. It will deposit more than another. It's unknown who the major contributor is in the carabiner. There are no known people that were contributors on that carabiner. So it sounded like he's saying not even Corey Kaufman. DNA was on that carabiner, not let alone any of the defendants. As a major contributor, I should clarify that. As a minor contributor, Corey Kaufman DNA did show up, but that's as a minor contributor, so it's not a complete profile. The .22 caliber bullet. There are 2 male contributors on that bullet. There's an unknown male major contributor, and there was a minor contributor that was too weak to determine. So the DNA got mixed up, and if Corey Kaufman's DNA was on there, it wouldn't be a surprise, because my remembering is Cherie Hendricks had dumped the bullet and all the clothes and the bones and everything into one bag initially when she had bagged the evidence. When Stanislaus County Sheriff's Department, Corey Brown and Kurt Bunch picked it up, they were in different containers at that time. Everything had been separated, but she had testified that she threw everything in the bag, to my memory. Again, he's talking about soil is a detrimental to DNA, and it will degrade. So there's lots of information in these profiles and stuff. The DOJ bullet samples. Remember, it was that mushroom bullet that came from the Department of Justice, and they had sampled it, and then they saved it, sent him the samples that they had taken of that bullet. He used a global filer, like required by the FBI. He determined that there is a major contributor on that bullet. Corey Kaufman is a possible contributor. He didn't really have a match, it sounded like. He's a possible contributor, and there's a mixture of 2 males. The prior 9 samples are not a contributor. Those are the defendants, Robert Woody all the way through to Frank CARSON, that list of people that I gave just a minute ago. The swabs taken off the bullet, it was incomplete to determine if Corey Kaufman was on those swabs. Again, he's talking about exposure to could degrade. There was no other testings or comparisons. The samples had been delivered by Dale Lingefelt. Some of the items are still in his possession. And some of these samples that he ran are still in his possession. So, basically, Marlis Ferrer didn't have any more questions. But basically what he was saying is there was no confirmed blood on the jacket, the shirt, the boots. He did not test the pants. He tested the bullet. it's inconclusive, apparently, from what I understood, on the bullet. Corey Kaufman was a contributor of the bullet, but there's no real confirmation of it because there wasn't enough markers there to determine. This is how I understood what he said. And remember, Christine Hendricks threw that bullet in with the clothes and the bones originally with the bag when she first recovered the remains. And he's saying that over time, the soil can degrade, the weather can degrade, moisture can degrade. She asked him if animals would help degrade samples, and he said no. You could tell from animals it would still distinguish human from animals, so that really didn't affect it if animals were affecting the body and such. So Percy Martinez began his cross and asked him, he tested the jacket and it was negative for human blood and DNA, and yes, he said they were both negative. The interior of the jacket was heavily soiled with dirt. He saw the dirt. There was some sand or something that came off the jacket, but he did not test the soil. He says, I'm not a soil expert. He said, that's not my area of expertise. I wouldn't know, one from another. The interior of the jacket and the upper half of the jacket were both soiled. He said, and there was some a little remnants of soil, like on the table when they set the jacket out or wherever they put it. He said the bottom part of the jacket was not as heavily soiled. Only the top part of the jacket had these colors, this coloration. It's a reddish brown discoloration. They did go into quite a bit about how the reddish brown is the color that blood turns after it sits for a certain amount of time, and it doesn't take long. You have to have the right environment for blood to stay like a red color. If you took a vial of your blood and stuck it in the freezer, it would stay red. If you let it thaw and sit outside in the elements and stuff, it would start deteriorating and changing colors. And that's the example that he used. He couldn't really say if anything was degraded by the soil or any specific item. He never went to the scene, any scene. He never alleged scenes. He never really actually went and looked. So he wouldn't know. And he's not a soil expert anyway, so he wouldn't know. And he rarely admitted it. This man, I felt, was very straightforward and honest. He examined the boots. He tested for blood. He checked the outside. He said he just checked the outside, but then a little while later, he's actually said he couldn't visibly check the inside. But he did take some type of cloth or a swab or something and rubbed the inside up, stuck his hand inside the boot and rubbed it where the toe is and stuff to check for blood. There was no visible blood on the inside that he could see, but of course he can't see up the toe. The boots were colored a brown reddish color, so it was hard to tell if there was any stains or not. But he did check to see if there's any indicators, presumptuous and all. There was nothing found. He said there was no stains on the inserts, and there was no stains that he could see on either boot, right or left. On the swabs of the carabiner, this Percy Martinez is still doing cross. It tested negative for blood, but the DNA sample obtained that it compared to against all the defendants, they were not a contributor to anything that was on that carabiner. Though it didn't test positive for hemoglobin or blood, there still was some DNA samples on there. But so Corey Kaufman was one of the contributors. I think he said a minor contributor, but nobody else that was on the list or defended in this case was. The spent bullet was tested for DNA, but not. There was no blood. There was no major contributor on this. I'm sorry. There was one major contributor and one minor contributor, but no defendants were a contributor on that bullet. Corey Kaufman could have been a contributor, but I think he said he was a minor contributor, which means there was a weak sample on that bullet. That could also come from throwing that bullet in with the clothes and bones and stuff when they first recovered the remains. The small amount of liquid it was a weak sample, was possibly Corey Kaufman's as the contributor of that small amount. And he's talking about on that spent bullet again. Down below the mushroom part, there's a little base of the bullet. There was some materials there. Then he had stuck the whole bullet in his solutions and how they extract DNA from there. Corey Kaufman is not a confirmed contributor to that DNA sample. It's just a possible he hasn't been excluded. That's how they do it. And it's a minor contributor, so there's not a strong sample there. The DOJ swabs of the defendants none of the DOJ swabs of the defendants were contributors, major or minor. He was asked if he saw some sand, if he checked the pockets or anything like that on the jacket. He said yes, he did see some sand. There was some residue of sand, but he did not preserve any samples or do any testing. He's not a sand person. He's a DNA person. He did his testing in 2017. And he said he had tested previously for 1.5 or more years, and DNA can be found in samples that have been exposed for long periods of time. Percy Martinez had no more questions. Hans started questioning. He was asking about false confessions in a case, what it was a double homicide of 2 little girls. The lab did their testing and found nothing. This was the state lab. Found nothing. The father had confessed, and the defense had hired him and somebody else he was working with to do some tests on this stuff. And they found some semen stains that were missed by the lab. They were on one of the girls' clothing. There was some semen stains. It was a rape homicide. The father had confessed to it for some reason, and it was a semen stain that was on the clothing that it was missed by the forensic people at that time. And years later, they had a series of rapes and homicides that occurred. This was back in Virginia or somewhere back there. That a man was caught. One of the girls that was attacked was able to escape, and the suspect was arrested a very short time later. They were able to track that sample to this guy on that original homicide. And so that's why he talked about false impression confessions and how things go that way sometimes. And the guy that done the rape and the homicide, he was actually a military person. And so he had been moved around some through bases and stuff. He says in this case, in the CARSON case, the Corey Kaufman homicide case, he found several profiles, but not any defendants in this case. So doing the DNA testing, he found some samples, and when he said that, he didn't say if they were strong or weak or major or minor or any of that stuff. But there was no other people that were given for him to check this DNA against. So the DNA did not match anybody that's been charged in this case. They had unknown profiles, so they did not have him check anybody else. He said that the presumptive test can be a false positive, as it could be an animal. Animal blood will give him a false positive. He has to do more testing to confirm it's not an animal. Again, all tests were negative for any of the defendants. On the jacket, the shirt, and the boots, there was no blood found. And Marlissa Ferreira, again, is trying to say that it's because of the environment up there that the samples were degraded. He talked about the term half-life, and that's used in the way he described it in the scientific community. Say you have plutonium that sits for a certain amount of time, X amount of days, you start getting half-life, the half-strength of that plutonium. And well, he says the blood and the DNA sampling is the same way. You'll get half-life after a certain amount of time under certain conditions. The DNA will degrade more quickly than blood. But he did locate the DNA in some of the items, but he did not locate any blood. Now, they're saying Corey Kaufman's DNA was found, but no defendant's DNA was found. So what they're saying is that the DNA will degrade faster than the blood samples will degrade. Say there was blood on the boots, the DNA would degrade faster than the blood. Well, on certain things like the carabiner, Corey Kaufman came up on the carabiner and the bullet. But there was no blood. The DNA degrades faster than the blood, but there's no blood. There's no DNA of any of the defendants in this case located anywhere either. He was asked how he did the sampling, and what he was wearing. So the precautions he takes to not contribute any DNA to the samples. He wears a lab coat and gloves while he's doing the testing, and every sample he goes to, he changes gloves. So you could have a sample that's been, somehow exchanged onto a pair of gloves. So every sample, they change gloves so they're not transferring to another sample. He talked about ATF lab, Alcohol and Tobacco and Firearms Lab, had done a backyard study. Apparently it sounded like one of the people at ATF lab had just did this in his backyard, put some blood samples out there in certain environments, and tested, every so often. And we're talking minutes, hours, or something along that line. And it showed a loss of material within 18 hours to a week. They're talking about the half-life and stuff, so it degrades very quickly. The way to preserve blood is to freeze the blood. DNA dissolves faster. Jai Gohil went to, his turn questioning the DNA expert. Again, he asked him, no defendant in court showed any DNA samples on any of the evidence that he tested. When he received the items, he said he had information that the body was down for over a year, or year to year and a half. But he still tested knowing that the items, that the body had been down that long. He says, yeah, I still tested because we still get samples. We still get DNA. We still get blood after that amount of time. Sometimes it'll show for years afterward, is what he said. The carabiner and the bullet were both exposed to same elements described as everything else, like the jacket and the shirt and the boots and etc. He got some positive reactions to DNA on the blood. On the bullet and the carabiner, but nothing else. There's no defendant DNA anywhere around any of this stuff. He said that Dale Lingerfeld, who had dropped off many of these items, provided names and the DNA, the buccal swabs. There was no... I can't even read my handwriting here. Sometimes it's like hieroglyphics. There was no sock. The miracle bullet, that unspent round that was found, that nobody knows where it came from. They can't remember who picked it up at the scene. It was just in the evidence, and nobody knows anything about it. That was not tested. There was a sock, or at least a partial sock, that was not tested. He said there was no blood stains on the boot, inside or out. He never told Marlissa Ferreira that there were, because apparently it does not say in his report that there were none present. It just has all his technical jargon, and so he never told Marlissa Ferreira there was any blood stains. And he was asked if he had mentioned this to her at any time. He said, well, yeah, the other day I had a real short phone call with her, a 17-second phone call with her, and I told her about some of this stuff. He was asked about something new in the DNA science field, about touch DNA. That's where if I pick up a pencil, set it down, somebody else picks up that pencil, sets it down. There's two DNAs on that pencil just from touching it. It can also be transferred to, if I pick up another pencil, that other person's DNA could be transferred to that other pencil. So he talked a little bit about touch DNA, but he didn't really go into anything specific about it. It's new. It wasn't used in this case. And he was also asked if improper handling of the evidence, even with gloves, can transfer DNA. And that's what he's talking about with the touch DNA. And he said, yes, it could. So there was no further questions from Jai Gohil on that. Marlissa Ferreira started redirect again. He talked about the glove, wearing the gloves, and it's not very likely that anything got transferred from the gloves from what he was using. On the .22 caliber bullet, again, the profile was incomplete, so no determination was made. There was two actually DNA profiles or markers or whatever you want to call them, but it wasn't complete enough to make any type of comparison. There was two samples, but again, too weak to determine. The carabiner, he cannot exclude anyone because he doesn't have any information. He can't exclude somebody, but to me, that is excluding them if you don't have information. I didn't really understand the way he said that. He was looking at an aspect of assuming that it's there, but he can't exclude anyone and say it's not there, even though it's not there. That's the way I took what he said. Maybe that's wrong, but that's the way I took it. On the bullet, there was no profile of what was submitted to him under the swab, the buccal swabs and such. Again, they talked about touch DNA. It can be samples can be transferred from one, a pencil, or even on a glove if they're testing. And don't forget to change your gloves from one sample to another. It's very easy, he says, to transfer DNA from one item to another. The bone powder that came from the Department of Justice was he used a teaspoonful for up to about 40 tests. So that's how much they sent him, is what he's saying. There's a teaspoonful of about 40 tests worth of teaspoonfuls. Going into the case that he cited, again, she's asking about the government lab is the one that failed to find the semen sample on the clothes. And he did actually work for the defense on that case. There was a long sidebar and a question that somebody had. It was a very long sidebar. So when they came back from the sidebar, Marlissa Ferrer asked him if he could put a number on the level of the DNA, and he went into a lengthy description of the calculation of coming up with these numbers. It was very lengthy, to tell you the truth. He's a scientist. So on the bullet, it was one person out of 4,300 that gave that sample on the bullet. So it was pretty sure it was Corey Kaufman's DNA on that bullet. On the DOJ stuff he received, there's 1 in 10 billion chance that one of these people Corey Kaufman was involved. So it's very, very possible, but very unlikely. There's 1 in 10 billion. And he says again, combining the exposure after 1.5 years, blood and DNA, saving samples. They went into this talk again. The length of the samples and the weather effects and all this stuff. They went all over that same stuff we talked about a couple times already. Animals will not interfere with DNA. It may give you a presumptive test and then come out animal blood. But even if animals are intermingling with the body, the remains, like this case, some of the stuff ended up in the rat holes, like the boots and stuff, or parts of the boots and what have you. He can still distinguish between animals and humans. Then Marlissa Ferrer asked him a really interesting question. She says, Can you test for DNA on something or a piece of evidence or something that would get DNA off of it if you don't have it? That's what she said. Of course he can't. I can't eat a bologna sandwich that I don't have either. Seriously. So she's talking. Then she started talking about parts of the shirt, the jacket, and so on. He said they're non-existent. So can you get DNA off of that piece of a shirt that you don't have? Come on. Okay. Then he talked about he did a presumptive test on the interior of the boot. It was also negative. So that's where we left off. So that was the end of the day. He's going to come back tomorrow. He had another court date to make, but he's stuck on this one now. That's how it works. So he is coming back at 10:30 for the jury to come back at 10:30 tomorrow. Just to be clear. Attorneys are in at 9 o'clock. They got another hearing, another 402 hearing. Remember, a 402 is an evidentiary hearing. What they're going to do tomorrow is talk about the cadaver dogs and some of the information they've been trying to get training records and all kinds of things on the cadaver dogs and haven't been able to do it. So they're trying to do it now. They're having a 402 hearing on some of this stuff, and there was some conversation about the CV or the resume of the dog handler, and they seem to have some concerns about that. I don't know the details. So back tomorrow for that, tomorrow at 9 a.m. I won't be there at 9 o'clock. I have a doctor's appointment in the morning. I'll be there shortly after. Tom will be there. I just talked to him. He's going to be there in the morning. So that's where we're at. You notice Tom's report. He did give kudos to Kurt Bunch and his new haircut, and everybody was appreciative of it today. I also want to note on the poll I put up, I believe it was Sunday, I've had over 1,000 views on that article and 500 and I believe almost 70 votes on that poll. I like to appreciate everybody's activity on that. It's still there if you want. It's a poll about if Kirk Bunch really deserves to be called an asshole. The poll will close next weekend. They only stay up for about a week. Or they stay up, but you can only vote on them for about a week. And then I will post the results. I think it's only fair that we do that for Mr. Bunch, and that we try to keep an even keel on this, and with his haircut too. So he looked dapper today. So that's all I got. Be back tomorrow, same time, same place, and don't forget my sponsors. I got the PayPal button at the bottom of each post. My sponsors: Doug Maynard, attorney at law; Merced Tile Supply. And Merced, they both good guys. I'll take care of you for your needs. And don't forget what I said. Don't take my word for it. Come to court and find out for yourself. Good night, everybody.